Hey everybody, Dr. Dave Nichol back with another episode of Freewheeling, the show where normally you ask questions and I would answer them, but today I just want to talk about the relevance of the veterinarian in the role of animal healthcare, which is kind of what we're there to do. Now, if you hadn't noticed, our role and the relevance of our role has been under threat from some time, and I think has been diminishing in some ways for some time. So the pet healthcare market, the global animal care market is huge. The veterinary slice of it is small. But it's a very, very important part of it because people trust veterinarians implicitly. And that veterinary recommendation drives a lot of other things to happen, whether it's food to go on our plates through food production, or medications to get dispensed, or animals to be healed, or policy to be set. Veterinarians have a super important part to play in that. But it's been under threat. And so there's three threats that I've seen impacting, and I just wanted to talk about that and just air my views. And I was just curious as to what anybody else was seeing out there and what you saw as being the threats. But three big macro trends I've been looking at. First of all is the sort of information assault. And that's eroded relevance because once upon a time, we could just tell a client what we wanted to have them do. And we'd be wearing our white jacket and, we'd be behind our degrees on our walls, and the clients would rather blindly follow our advice. Back then, times were perhaps simpler, treatments less extravagant, less expensive, and that's completely changed. And the thing that changed that was the internet, because suddenly the information was suddenly out there and available to the market, and so the power that was with the buyers in the market changed completely because of this disruptive technology called the internet. That was phase one. And I think we're still suffering. To be completely honest, I don't think we've gotten over that insult. And I think the evidence for me not thinking we've done a good job of that is in, let's look at things like vaccination rates. We're still pontificating about evidence-based medicine, which is really important, right? But we're not talking a language clients understand. And so who are they listening to? They're listening to people who have a compelling story. So what we're doing is we're producing journals and reports and evidence, but we're not converting that into being a great story. And so clients are not listening. So who are they listening to? The crazy people who are telling a good story. Anecdotal, but storytelling. And so that impact is now why we see vaccination rates falling, because the naysayers, the people who've cooked up the stories that vaccines are bad and it's all about big pharma and money, that voice is winning. In the current climate. So that's the first thing, information. The second thing is technology. And information is kind of technology, but now we're starting to look at, as the internet grows up, handling bigger bandwidths and technological advance coming on. Telemedicine is clearly another big influence, and there's all manner of stuff happening at the minute, and decisions being made at the minute, which you need to be aware of, that because they're going to affect your ability to practice, and potentially they're going to affect who can make decisions on the behalf of animals in the future. An area that has traditionally, but has been eroded away from the veterinary position, is now under, I think, one of the biggest threats it's ever seen. And if legislation gets passed or amendments are made to Veterinary Surgeons Acts to allow telemedicine to happen and to not have to take a full and thorough physical examination or history taking, and that decisions can be made on that basis, yes, that opens up a whole market. But does that do something that's in the interest of animal care? I don't think so. But that's something that you need to make your own decision up and make your voice heard with your professional body, whether that's the Royal College here, the BVA here, AVMA, or the AVA. These are big questions that traditionally markets get way ahead of regulators, and decisions are then made retrospectively. I don't think we can afford to be behind the curve on this, and I don't think anyone's anywhere near ahead of this enough en masse to make good representations, and so we have to do more. If you're not aware of any of this, start learning about it right away. Telemedicine's kind of where it's at. And then the third area, and this sounds much more occult, and we're seeing it much more in the UK. We're very much advanced here, and that's the rise of corporatization or corporate ownership. So practices being rolled up by private equity money to then be sold on at a greater multiple, either float as an IPO or somebody else, an end user, buy them and then have to run them. But practices are, that's happening, and as long as the market's growing, that's okay for the private equity people. But their focus is money, ultimately, and so the things that are happening now are price pressure on areas that can be more easily managed, and obviously the supply chain is the big area that corporate medicine has a huge advantage, or corporate ownership gives a huge advantage. The supply chain and the ability, suddenly if you've got 100 practices, 200, 300, 400, 500, the bigger you get, the bigger your power as a purchaser and the more squeeze you can put on suppliers. And so one of the things that's happened, and this is how this links to veterinary relevance, is rather than have to have a pharma company now or a supplier of a medical goods or services, once upon a time we'd have to convince all of us veterinarians this was a good idea, present information, convince us and get the herd to move en masse, which actually is pretty labor intensive, quite expensive, because you've got to put people on the ground, you've got to put a lot of money into advertising, research, and communications. Whereas now if you've got a group with 1,000 practices, you might have a clinical steering body of 10 people, let's say, and then a procurement process to get through. That is a lot less people to convince that your product is good. So there are still veterinarians involved in that decision making, but you've shrunk the hive mind down from a factor of 1,000 to 10 or 15 or whatever that number is. It's a massive shrinkage. And so there's risk in that. There's risk in, again, the relevance, how powerful is the veterinary recommendation at that point on that scale. And so the risk is of a lot of veterinary voices becoming far, far less relevant, and there being other influences that can influence those decisions rather than just clinical, which once would have been much more purely that. So I think there are threats out there to us, and they're all working together. So the internet is there working at us from the client side of things. Technology is there, which is going to change the competitive landscape completely. And I think that's going to get way more interesting as we move over the next 5 to 10 years. And then you've got the influence of buying power in the supply chain. None of this looks like brilliant news for veterinarians en masse. Will we exist in the same way in 5 to 10 years? Probably not. Is that a bad thing? Don't know. But what we mustn't do is become irrelevant. We have a shortage of veterinarians just now. We clearly have challenges integrating the demands of the workforce with the needs of the workforce with the demands of the job. But I think relevance of the veterinary, as soon as a vet becomes irrelevant, that's not good for an animal, because there's no getting away from the fact that veterinarians will always be the strongest advocate for animal welfare, and that needs to continue. And so we need to up our game. We need to up our communication game. We need to up our representation game and our engagement with the people that represent our best interests. And we need to make sure that voices are heard in the ever-changing market that is happening within the new ownership structures that exist. So there you go. There's 3 threats on relevance. What do you think? Chuck in your 2 penneth worth. Love to hear from you. Let's get a conversation, debate going. Instagram, Facebook, right beneath here in the comments. Love to hear what you're thinking. Where do veterinarians sit? Are we relevant? Do we matter? Does that matter? Discuss. Over to you. Be safe, be well, be happy.